So there are several classical theories about what emotions actually are. One of the most famous is the James Lange theory. That's William James, actually, the founder of functionalism, that approach in psychology. And he wrote the Principles of Psychology. He's quite poetic in how he writes. He has really excellent definitions about various things. But the James Lange theory proposed that emotions were experienced when the organism, including people, became aware of visceral and somatic changes, bodily changes that were induced by some stimulus, by some event. So their idea was kind of like, the tiger leaps at you, and you go like this. Your body responds. You're more aroused, etc. And then you actually feel the emotion, right? So actually, this is probably closer to the sort of Damasio approach, which is the somatic marker hypothesis, which is how the mapping basically of the changes in the body are the feeling. It just is a better definition, like the actual bodily changes and responses that James and Lange posited too are in response to the various stimuli that provoke those changes. That's the emotional response. That includes changes in facial expression, in your voice, in your posture, sweat, sympathetic activation, for example, muscle tension, reticular activating system activity, all these, orienting, all these things are emotional responses. Facial expression changes. A lot of these mediated by, aspects of our central autonomic network and the brainstem, nuclei that control facial expression, through the facial nerve, postural adjustment, etc. So this was the emotion, and then that would be followed by what James Lange also called emotion, but what Damasio, I think, more helpfully calls something different, the feeling of that emotion. So this is like the mapping at the level of the brain. There was another theory. It was called the Cannon-Bard theory, which was in opposition, basically, which suggested that emotions result from concurrent brainstem and cortical events. But there are timed aspects actually here. There are stimuli that provoke bodily changes. Including the release of hormones. Again, those facial expression, voice, postural adjustments, etc. And that constitutes the emotion. And then there is transit to networks in the brain that will allow for perceptual experience, and that more helpfully, I think, is we think of as sort of the felt response. But where there's complexity here is that yes, the tiger leaps at you, right, provokes these bodily changes, the arousal and the bodily emotional response first, followed by the mapped perceptual experience. However, later you might internally, you probably will recall, right, the tiger leaping at you. So here you're getting an emotionally competent stimulus that you're generating internally, right? And then that's going to lead to, it turns out, remapping of areas in the brain, limbic and paralimbic areas that map the internal state of the body, including, for example, maps that are, maintained, in the insular lobe, right, of the visceral, emotionally salient aspects of your body, actually. Well, there's a lot of, insular frontal lobe connectivity, right? And sort of, we'll talk later about default, mode or default networks. So access to medial temporal lobe, memories of specific events, a lot of subcortical contributions like the amygdala that may be, sensitized to stimuli that are linked to the initial leap of the tiger at you and can generate, changes in the mapping in the insula at the level of the cortex. So you could actually, have the tiger leap at you. All these changes occur in your body in response, like, and then it gets mapped and you feel, fear or, terror or, curiosity. I don't know how you respond to a tiger leaping at you. Or you could generate internally an emotionally competent stimulus, a memory of that tiger, or something that is linked to the experience, of encountering that tiger. These emotionally competent stimuli, they can drive bodily changes and responses or changes in the cortical maps that allow for our perceptual experience, that support our perceptual experience, our feelings. Can be conscious, right? We could be consciously perceiving this, or their origins can be unconscious. We may not be explicitly aware, of what's driving, these bodily responses, or in some cases these changes in the mapping, just of how our body is currently, potentially arrayed. So I think it's a really interesting topic for discussion. But an emotion, again, basically according to the somatic marker hypothesis, which is kind of how we're going to be proceeding this week in discussing emotion and feeling in the brain. Again, our actions and movements, many of them public, visible to others as they occur in our faces and our voices, in specific behaviors, but also galvanic skin response changes. We can detect sympathetic activation, for example. Hormonal assays can be utilized to assess these emotional responses, bodily emotional responses. We can use ERP, right? For example, we can see a novelty, P300, for example, and we're going to see that feelings, are more based on the maps that are linked to these, linked to other cognitive networks that are involved in memory, in decision making, in attention, etc. And just to make one last sort of key point about this, the emotion competent stimuli, right? Can be the tiger, right? Present right here in your environment. Or it could be a memory, right? That triggers these bodily sorts of emotional, kinds of responses. So we'll talk more about this when we sit down in class.